Again, Melissa, I'll let you take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Hi, everybody. As Stephanie already introduced, my name is Melissa Garcia, and I'm one of the owners at Altitude Community Law. All we do is HOA law. So if you are on an HOA or in a board or thinking of getting on the board, we have a lot of stuff and material on our website. So as Stephanie said, there's a lot of resources there. We've been in business for over 30 years now, and all I do is HOA law. I've been in practice for over 21 years now. And one of the things I love to do is teach. So whenever there's an opportunity to teach, I will teach. And I was really happy that Bruce reached out to me because amending governing documents seems to be such a trending topic right now. I'd say in the last 5 years, just my practice with respect to amending documents has probably tripled because so many people and so many associations at this point are at that stage in their association where their documents no longer really make any sense and they're looking to amend. So I'm glad I'm teaching about it tonight. Thankful for everybody here on the class. I'm going to speak about 30 minutes here, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. I do have 4 or 5 questions that were already provided to me ahead of time that I'll get to at the end of the presentation. And then if there's time left, I'll also answer some questions that come up. And again, go ahead and put them in the chat box or wait until the end of the presentation in order to ask your question, and we'll hopefully get to it. If not, after the class, you can always shoot me an email or call me or something, and we can handle it that way. Okay, next slide. So we're talking about amending documents, obviously. Are your governing documents good, bad, or ugly? I should have had my Clint Eastwood song in the background with all the whistling of good, bad, and ugly, but I forgot. But at any rate, let's just quickly talk about the 3 signs you should consider amending. Now, the first one of your documents is more than 10 years old. This is important because the legislature over the last 10 years has really been concentrating on HOAs and trying to incorporate more transparency type provisions, more opportunities for homeowners to observe decision making. And so you might think that, oh, well, I know my documents like the back of my hand, but what good is that if you're following bad documents that are now contrary to Colorado law? I've had so many boards think, oh, well, this is great. I'm following it to a T, only for me to tell them that, you know what, you're violating Colorado law if you continue to follow those provisions in your documents. So that's number one. If your documents are over 10 years old, there's probably a lot of them that are contrary to Colorado and federal law. Number 2, you've consulted an attorney more than 3 times in the last year for interpretation. Who hates legalese? Who hates ambiguous documents? I know I do. And although I love the idea of everybody calling me for an opinion and me lining my pockets giving legal opinions, why spend all that money sending me these interpretation questions? The better thing to do would be to spend a little bit more money on the front end to just rewrite those documents or amend them so that they actually do make sense and you can read them. You don't have to keep calling your attorney, although I do love getting calls. So number 3, consistently fail to meet or enforce document requirements. This really has to do with liability, because if you have a document that says very clearly, no dogs allowed, okay? And why would you have a document that says no dogs allowed? Everybody loves dogs. But if you have a document that says no dogs allowed and nobody's enforcing that, nobody's been enforcing it for the last 10 years, and there's 2 dogs in every household, and then somebody comes into the community and buys into the community knowing that no dogs are allowed because that's what it says clearly in the documents. If you don't amend that provision out, then you're kind of in the between the rock and the hard place, because you're exposing yourself to liability for failure to enforce. That's probably one of the number 1 claims against HOAs today, is that they're failing to enforce clearly written documents. So if it no longer makes sense for your community, you need to get rid of that, or it's going to be a liability issue. Okay, next slide. So general reasons you should consider amending. This is just easy to see right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is just a list of it, and I'm going to go and give you examples of each one of these in the next few slides. So let's go ahead and move on. Okay, number 1, provisions not current with Colorado law. You know, I have 4 things here. There's probably more, 10 times that many provisions now that are probably contrary to Colorado law, but I wanted to give you some examples. So for example, political signs. I know that last year and even moving into this year, early this year, political signs and just political issues has been a hotbed for HOAs, of legal issues and all that. But I'll bet you most declarations say something like, no signs allowed except for sale or for rent signs, and maybe those that are approved by the board. So that in itself is already contrary to Colorado law, because it was changed about 10 years ago to provide these sort of public policy type provisions that allow everybody to exercise their rights to install political signs within property that they own. So if you are consistently requiring somebody to take off the political signs from their lawn because you don't want to deal with all the other issues that come with that, that's going to be a violation of Colorado law, because state law now requires you to allow them. And of course, there's a whole other class about what's a political sign and how you can regulate, but that in itself is against Colorado law if you ban political signs. The second thing that is more prevalent, I think, in most associations is satellite dishes. So satellite dishes are actually, certain satellite dishes are protected via federal law, the over-the-air reception device law. And so this is federal law, this isn't state law. And most say that you can't install a satellite dish without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. And I'll say probably 90% of the CC&Rs and covenants that I see say that. Now, you do have the right to regulate how they're installed and where they're installed, but asking somebody to get prior approval has been deemed a violation of federal law because it's seen as unreasonably delaying the owner's right to install a satellite dish, a protected satellite dish, within their property. So it's not, we're not speaking about how you can regulate them, but just that one provision alone is constantly violated by associations everywhere, because they feel, well, how are we going to regulate that if we can't make them get prior approval before installing? So that's another question for another day, but just know that if that provision's in your declaration, it's contrary to federal law. So the bylaws. I think probably a lot of CONO folks already know some of these notice requirements, but a lot of you don't. So those that are subject to CIOA, the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, those associations that are subject to CIOA have to follow certain notice requirements. And what a lot of associations don't know is that, again, maybe 10 years ago, the statute was revised to provide additional notice requirements over and above what you typically send for owners' meetings. So in addition to mailing that notice out to homeowners, you now also have to physically post it somewhere in the community. And you also, if you have the ability to give email notice and somebody requests, you have to give email notice of those owner meetings as well. So that's something that a lot of boards don't know. Secret ballots is another new requirement, to the extent that there's a contested election. And what that means is more people are running for the board than positions open. So if that ever happens, because usually that never happens, it's the other way around, you can't get enough people on your board. But if it does happen, then those elections have to be conducted by secret written ballot. So that's caused a big uproar now because of virtual meetings that have to occur, and how do you keep it secret in a virtual meeting? And that again is a whole other class. But again, it's a new provision that, well, somewhat new, that is now required per Colorado law. And if you're following bylaws that allow you to conduct contested elections without using a secret ballot, then you're violating Colorado law. Okay, next slide. And again, those are just a couple of provisions, and there's so many more that are contrary now. So limitations, here's another reason why: no flexibility in your documents. Caps on assessments. If you have documents that say you can't increase your assessments every year over 2% without getting 75% approval from homeowners, it's going to be very difficult for you to even address increasing needs and costs and fees and everything, and cost of living and all of that. So that's not a good thing. You need to be able to, the board needs to not have their hands tied when they're trying to operate the community with the expenses. It makes no difference if you have a fine, for example, that says, or a fine policy or declaration that says you can only fine $10 for every violation. Well, how is that going to induce somebody to comply? We have the real life example of an association that says no RVs in the community. And a guy was just parking that RV in the community every weekend. And they were saying, okay, we're going to fine you $10. Oh, big whoop. This person would rather pay the $10 than pay for offsite storage. It doesn't induce compliance. So those are no way, no flexibility, and no way to really enforce the documents with these kinds of caps. Bylaws, quorum. You know what quorum means? I hope you know what quorum means. Quorum means the number of people that have to be present in a meeting in order to conduct or to take action at that meeting. If you have a quorum that says 50% and you have 300 units or lots, it's very, very, very difficult to get that every single time. And guess what? You can't take any action. You can't elect directors. You can't amend the documents if you don't have that quorum. Unanimous approval for board action by email. I don't know how many of you regularly conduct board meetings via email, not meetings, but board votes by email. So sending out an email saying, hey, let's hire this new landscaping company, and everybody votes by email. Well, a lot of bylaws out there say that in order to take action without a meeting by the board, you have to get unanimous approval. A lot of them say that, not all of them, but I'd say a good 60, 70% of them say that. So that's another flexibility if you're constantly doing this, because the statute allows a more flexible way to do this. And if you don't amend to be consistent with the statute, then you're stuck with that unanimous approval. Not a good thing. Next slide. Inconsistent provisions. This is a hierarchy of authority, which essentially lays out all the documents and essentially if there's any kind of inconsistency between and among these documents, the higher one's going to control. So for example, if there's something in the bylaws and it is contrary to the declaration is going to control because it's higher on this hierarchy authority. One example that is very typical is an inconsistency between the bylaws and the articles of incorporation. Most people, when they're trying to figure out how many directors they have to have, look to the bylaws, because that's the typical document. That's the operational document that tells you how many directors you need to have. But what they don't typically do is look at the articles of incorporation, which also almost always cover number of directors as well. And usually I see something like the bylaws saying you can have 3 or you can have 5 directors. And then I look at the articles, and the articles only say you can have 3 directors. Well, guess what? The articles are going to control. So, why not amend to make them consistent? Next slide. Ambiguous and difficult to interpret. So, just look at what is a commercial vehicle? Is that a cement truck? Is that a Comcast vehicle with a bunch of ads all over it? Or is it a little pink Cadillac with a tiny Mary Kay sticker on it because it's being used to sell Mary Kay products? So what is it? And we've had fights within associations over what this means. What does commercial vehicle mean? And if you have an ambiguous provision, boards are entitled to adopt a reasonable interpretation of it, but why not just clean it up and say, what exactly does it mean? What do you mean by screen from view? Does that mean you can't see it with a naked eye? Does that mean that it has to be screened with a privacy fence, 100% screened? Does it mean that the neighbor next door can't see it, or it can't be seen from the public street? I mean, these are all the different ways that you can interpret screen from view. Does it mean, can I screen it with landscaping? We get that all the time. So this is the type of issue that, could cause problems. And then of course, maintenance and insurance provisions. If you have a condo community and everybody, how do you, if it says that the unit boundaries are the wall, floor, and ceiling, where does the wall start? At the studs, at the drywall, at the paint? So next slide. Gaps and Gaps and undesirable obsolete provisions. All of these are all trending topics. I just wanted to show a lot of them. Everybody right now is wanting to address short-term rentals. I wanted to mention COVID-related provisions simply because what we're seeing in a lot of articles of incorporation are statements that the association's purpose is to advance the health and safety. And that might be seen as keeping them free from disease, which we don't want to. Hey, Harry, can you go ahead and mute your Harry? I think it's Harry. Okay, next slide.
And improve quality of life.
Okay, we go ahead and next slide.
It's good medicine.
All right, general amendment considerations. Something that I just wanted to bring up in terms of what, oh, thanks, Stephanie. What you should consider when you're trying to amend any of the documents, whether it's the covenants or bylaws or anything. First of all, that's really distracting, Harry. Whoever Harry is, please go ahead and mute your microphone. I'm going to speak really loud now to hopefully everybody else can hear. Okay. Oops. It looks like we lost the share screen.
Whoever is hosting should be able to mute everybody.
Oh yeah, Bruce, are you able to mute everyone?
I did.
Okay, great. Okay, and then we lost the PowerPoint.
That's what I figured.
Okay. Okay.
There we go.
Sorry, guys. I might go 5 minutes over, but I will get through all this.
No, thank you for
Oh,
troubleshooting.
no. That's okay. All right. So I know Bruce is going to get that back on in a second, but I'm going to go ahead and talk through that slide.
I'm sorry. I thought.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Great. Whoops. There we go. And then get back into the from current slide if you want to hit that. Perfect. Okay, so resolution or amendment. You don't necessarily have to amend something because, again, what courts will allow boards to do is adopt reasonable interpretation. The problem with that is your reasonable interpretation of something like household pets could be reinterpreted 5 years from now with a new board. So if you want something to stick, then amend and put it in the covenants. You don't necessarily have to do a complete rewrite of documents. You might just want to do a limited amendment to address just the critical issues. And also remember there's different approval requirements as well as different processes for obtaining approval, both on this slide. So just things to remember if you're moving forward with an amendment. Let's talk quickly about the approval requirements for each of the documents, amending the articles. Just quickly, it usually has an owner approval requirement, but if it doesn't in the documents, then the default approval is a majority of at least a quorum of owners. The board can change some things on its own, but it's very limited. So most likely you're going to have a majority of at least a quorum of owners to amend the articles. Amending the bylaws, this one's important. Probably the number one question I get is, can the board do it on its own? It depends. If you're pre-Kiowa, which means you were created prior to July 1st, 1992, then you can, except for quorum. If you're post-Kiowa, which means you were created on or after July 1st, 1992, then you can, except for quorum, terms and qualifications of directors, and powers and duties of the board. The only exception is to both of those is if the bylaws expressly prohibits the board from amending the bylaws. And of course, if you have owner approval requirements, it's document specific. So you have to look at the amendment provision. Amending the declaration. This one, the only thing I wanted to say about this is it's the one document that doesn't matter what it says in the documents, only the owners can approve it. And what Kiowa says, if you're subject to Kiowa, is no less than a majority and no more than 67% can approve that amendment to the declaration. So if you have something that has something higher than 67%, then read it to say 67%. There are a couple of exceptions, which I'm not going to go into tonight, but that's the general range. And then for the owner approval, make sure that you can do it by meeting or you can do it by mail. If you do it by meeting, make sure that you follow your bylaws requirements for meetings, such as notice and all of that. And you have to have in the notice that you're going to be proposing the amendment to the declaration or the bylaws or whatever it is. You can also do it by mail. There's very strict procedures under the Nonprofit Act, which is the other statute that governs HOAs. And you have to follow those specific procedures. And you can always get both Kiowa and the Nonprofit Act on our website, which is on the last slide. Okay, next slide. Some declarations will require not only homeowners to approve, but also lenders, mortgagees. So if you have this, thankfully, there is a process under Kiowa, if you're subject to Kiowa, that allows kind of an abbreviated process for amending the declaration to get the mortgagee approval. And it's right there, and it's essentially jump through these hoops, and assuming the mortgagee doesn't respond with an objection in 60 days, it's counted as a yes. So that's where the apathy actually works in your favor. So next slide. And then finally, if you are going to amend your declaration and you can't get owner approval because of apathy, not because of objection, but because of apathy, there's a last resort, and that's called the court petition process, where you have to prepare all this work, go to a hearing with your attorney, and essentially what you have to show is you at least got half of what you were required to get under the current declaration. So if it requires 67%, you have to get at least half of that. And no more than 33% objection by owners or mortgagees. That's important, because if you have 33% objection by homeowners, then you just spent a lot of money and wasted your time going to court, which is why I said you only use this if you can't get approval because of apathy, not objection. Okay, next slide. Amending the rules and guidelines, policies, and procedures. Usually the board gets to do this. I've rarely ever seen any documents that require homeowners approving rules, regulations, or policies, but you also have to follow the policy that you should have in place for amending and adopting rules and regulations and policies. So most of those policies say something like you have to provide an opportunity for input and feedback of the homeowners before you actually vote on those proposed rules and changes in policies, which is a good thing because you don't want to be acting in a vacuum as a board. Now that's rules and policies unilaterally. Architectural guidelines, that's document specific. So be careful. A lot of boards will think that they get to approve guideline changes, but some of the documents say only the Architectural Review Committee gets to approve changes. So that's document specific. Look at your docs. One thing I will say is that any kind of rules, policy, regulations, or guidelines that are approved, the court's going to weigh them and scrutinize them strictly and more heavily than they would something that's in the declaration in the covenants. And that's because the board gets to change these, not like the covenants, which the owners get to approve. So they're going to look at things like whether it's fair, whether it's reasonable, whether the homeowners got notice of it, whether it's overbroad and ambiguous, all that stuff. So be sure that that you, when you're writing your rules and regulations, that's fine for the board to do it on its own, maybe with some assistance from its management company, but make sure that you always have your attorney review it. Because again, if somebody challenges those rules and regulations, they are going to really, really strictly scrutinize those and heavily by the court, unlike the covenants. Next one. Okay, best practices for getting approval. So this is so important. I mean, this should always be at the beginning of the discussion when you're thinking about amending your documents, because by the time you get to the approval portion, you should already know it's going to be approved, and it's just an informal process of getting people to sign the dotted line. But number one, always make a wish list. If you're going through the documents and you're going to go through the trouble of getting 67% homeowner approval, for example, you only want to do it once. You don't want to go through it every couple of years, maybe once every 30 years or something, or 20 years. So the attorney is going to know what should be in there for legal issues and those kinds of things, and what might be inefficient for the operation of the community. But only you know what makes your community tick, what gaps are in your community, what things don't make sense that you should remove. So make that wish list. Number 2, form a document amendment committee. That should probably be number 1 if we're looking at this in hierarchy. So the board, unfortunately, what often happens is if the board decides to move forward with an amendment project, all of a sudden there's this invisible wall between the board and the homeowners, and, oh, hey, you're just trying to do this to get more power or something like that. It's just, and it's wrong. I mean, it's obviously the boards have put a lot of thought into this. One way to get rid of that invisible wall is to seek input and help from homeowners at the very beginning by forming a document amendment committee. This helps you shoulder that burden that is shouldered by the board alone will now be spread amongst the homeowners as well. And so when it comes time to articulate why you're doing this, and comes time to getting approval and ballots and votes back, then you have a strong set of people, not just the board, but a lot of people that can bring that throughout the community and get that job done. Obtain owner input and feedback prior to the vote. This is really important. A lot of boards will be very happy with the final drafts from the attorney and everything's good. They spent all this time and they finally got those final drafts, but they just want to be done with it and send it out to get it approved or to get it voted on. That's a mistake. You want to first post it on the website or email it to everybody and say, hey, we're not sending out these votes or these documents for vote yet, because we want you to have the opportunity to provide some input and feedback. This is the best time to weed out the red flags, because what you don't want is to have a provision that threatens to jeopardize the entire project. Maybe 35% of the people hate the prohibition against Airbnbs. Do you really want that to threaten the entire project? So you need this time to weed out the red flags, and then you'll be in a better position once that feedback is back, and maybe you've had some informational meetings to answer questions, so that by that time you'll know whether or not to throw out a couple of provisions and maybe tackle them later, and then just push forward the rest of the document. And then finally, make it very easy for them to vote. So you don't want to say, okay, here's the documents, now mail back the ballot, and then not give them a self-addressed stamped envelope. That's the easiest way for them to vote. Otherwise, they'll say, oh, okay, well, I'll vote on it. And then they'll be looking for the envelope, looking for the stamp. Just make it easy for them. Allow them to scan and email, if they can, that ballot back to you. That's an easy way for anybody to return a ballot. Allow them to drop it in maybe there's a lockbox if there's the ability for your association. Have them be able to drop it off with the board members, or fax it in, or drop it off with the management company. So make it very easy for them to vote, and otherwise you lose probably 20% of the votes right there. They're probably just going to throw it out. All right, next slide. I think I'm at the end of the slides. Am I?
Yeah, so I'm hitting to the next slide.
And it doesn't want to go? Okay, well, the next slide the next slide is really just a question answer. So that's all it says. But hopefully the slide that I gave you had, because the last slide has all those, there we go, all those resources.
That's
okay.
Better.
So I have 7 minutes left, and I think I have 7 minutes left for this. So I have 5 questions, it looks like 5 or 6 questions that were given to me, and I want to go through them really quickly, and I hopefully, and then after that, open it up. So the first question, our HOA is considering amending the declarations to restrict the number of units which can be rented. What are the limitations, state law? Typically, how are the restrictions applied? And does allowing a family member to live in a unit at below market rent or for free count as a rental? So state law doesn't limit anything when it comes to rentals. It's how, sometimes, so you can, state law essentially says whatever you put in your amendment, as long as it's not contrary to maybe federal law or to its own provisions, is okay, as long as you get the approval requirement from the owners. And right now, Colorado doesn't address leasing restrictions. Most states do. And they essentially say, as long as you get the appropriate approval, then you can pass that amendment. So I don't know why Colorado wouldn't follow that if it does become a court issue. Typically, how are the restrictions generally applied? Is it seniority of ownership, number of units already rented? So that's all up to you. There's no typical way. I've seen some that place a rental cap and they allow people on the waiting list that have been living in the community the longest get to be number one on the waiting list, for example. Some will restrict just short-term rentals. Others will restrict rental for the first year. They have to live there first. Others will prohibit it all outright, but grandfather in those who are currently renting so you can get their approval over the amendment. So it all depends on how you want to define your amendment. Does allowing a family member to live in a unit for below market rent or free count? So that also depends on how you want to define that amendment. Most associations will say leasing, the term leasing or renting excludes family members that are living in the unit. So they typically exclude it. You don't have to. So maybe you can charge your brother more than your mother. I don't know, but that's all up to you. You just craft it the way you want to. Number two, how formal must the process be to add a policy or a rule to our governing documents? So a policy or rule, I can't say how formal it must be because it is document specific. Some of them are extremely formal. Some of them will require you to send out the proposed rule for input and feedback before you actually adopt it into your governing documents. But I think what you need to remember is the legislature has been gently shoving us towards transparency. And so most likely there's going to be more legislation coming down saying, give opportunity for feedback prior to adopting that rule. So you might as well get used to it now. Okay, question 3, our declaration requires owner approval to amend it, but our bylaws can be amended by the board. If we want to adopt a new policy, what determines whether we can place it in the bylaws instead of the declaration and not have to seek owner approval? So you can't put provisions that you want to amend. If there's provisions that you want to amend from your declaration, you can't put the amendment in the bylaws, because remember that hierarchy that I showed in one of the slides, which you will get after the presentation in the next couple of days. Bylaws are lower on the hierarchy than the declaration. So anything you put in the bylaws has to be consistent with the declaration. So unfortunately, that's a really sneaky move and I love it, but you can do it for the declaration. So let's say your bylaws say that you have to get 85% of the homeowners to approve it, but your declaration only requires 67%. Well, the declaration's higher, so you can amend the declaration to say, bylaws amendments are only a majority of a quorum. So you can kind of do it the other way. But unfortunately, you can't just go to the easier document. Question number 4, our HOA has voluntary dues and this does not fall under Kiowa. So we don't have the ability to impose fines if we want to pursue enforcement against a well, you can all read this. I'm just going to answer this question. So if you can amend your documents. We've had, even if you're a voluntary association, we've had a couple of them that we've represented, that as long as you follow the amendment requirement in your declaration and you get the appropriate approval, you can add the requirement to pay assessments, which then makes you a Kiowa community. But if you don't want to go through the process and you think nobody's going to approve turning into a Kiowa community and becoming Kiowa compliant, then what you can do is, for voluntary associations, I would amend the declaration to add the ability to fine, because otherwise, if you don't have the ability to fine, you're always going to court to try to enforce your governing documents. And I would actually just cherry pick the provisions that are in Kiowa that you like and put them in your document. And that way you'll have the tools and the teeth to be able to enforce your governing documents without having to go to trial. What parts of Kiowa, if any, apply to commercial office condominiums that have a declaration dated May 1986? And what other statutes apply to this condominium association? So Kiowa, earlier in the slides, I talked about pre and post Kiowa associations, and there was a date. If you're a pre-Kiowa associations, which means you were created prior to July 1st, 1992, then only the pre-Kiowa provisions apply to your association. Whether you're a commercial office condo or a single family home, if you were created prior to that date, then only, and I will put this in the chat box afterwards. Well, I can probably, yeah, I'll go ahead and put this in there now. So there's a particular provision of Kiowa that you have to look up. So I put it in the chat box. You have to look this provision up, and it gives you all of the provisions under Kiowa that are applicable to pre-Kiowa associations. Now, commercial office condominiums are subject to Kiowa, but there's also subject, if they were created, if they're a pre-Kiowa association, to the Condominium Act. And I don't have the particular site in front of me, but whoever asked that question, you can always email me and I'll give you that site as well. If an HOA is updating its declaration and one proposed item is controversial, would you recommend separating the vote on that provision from the vote on the remainder of the proposed amendments? So yeah, I mean, that kind of goes back to what I previously said, which is prior to even amending, getting to that point, you should send it out and find out what that controversial provision is. And if you think that it's going to threaten the entire project, then go ahead and don't even put it in the new documents. Wait until you get the new documents approved and then attack it all by itself. Okay, I think I got everything. Did I get everything? I must
Yes.
have, because Bruce stopped the share screen. So,
That's right. So we can see everybody again.
Yeah,
that's a great
that was-
job. I would certainly encourage everybody who likes Melissa to view the longer version. She just did in about 30 minutes plus 5 minutes
Yeah.
of questions what she did in 60 last month. And it's really mainly because she cut off a lot of the examples. But that was a tremendous job. My adventure with governing documents started just really well in 2017, a previous time around, but I have more recently actually led my own there we go, have led my own HOAs process. And when I heard Melissa's presentation last month, I realized, wow, we did a lot of things right that could illustrate what she said, and a few things wrong. So I'm going to go through that. I'm about 1/10 as smart as her. So if she got 45 minutes, I'm going to try to do this in 4.5, and then we'll have discussion time. Just to give you a context, here's the view from my deck. We're in Villa Sierra, where I live. If you're in the Garden of the Gods and you're looking east at the Mesa and you see those beautiful luxury homes on the Mesa, that's not us. But if you look all the way to the right to the edge before it drops off, that's our condo community. Next time you're at High Point in the Garden of the Gods, the south part, or toward the south end, if you look a mile straight to your east, you can wave at me. Now, in one way, our situation is a little bit different. We didn't have a lot of obsolete work to redo. Our reason for updating the declaration again in 2020, after we just did it in 2017, was that there were some controversial rental provisions that got snuck in and some people didn't like it. So the obsolete issue wasn't as big, but we had a lot of others. And this is how we started. First, we got community input because people were upset about the rental stuff. The board formed a rental committee and they did a survey and they took input for almost a whole year to get a sense of where people wanted to go. Then they assembled what they called a compliance committee. They asked for volunteers who are willing to read through the governing documents and see what could be changed or could be improved. We call them the 4 nerds because we found 4 people, including me and Paul Scholl, who's also kindly listening in tonight, who actually like going through this. As we started, we realized we should consult with Rhonda Ashley from CB, who is our insurance broker. And so we said, look over the insurance issues and tell us anything that needs to be updated. And we ended up, with her help, doing a thorough rewrite of the fidelity insurance section that covers issues of fraud. As we were going through, we kept the community informed of our progress. We told them, here's where we are. We have some drafts together. If you want to know what we're doing, contact Bruce. He's the committee chair. Only one owner actually said, yes, I want to see your drafts, but they knew we were open. And then we finished our work and we gave it to the board to look at. In the course of doing this, we came up with a variety of things which happened to illustrate all 5 of Melissa's points for reasons to amend. Her number 1 was when you need to update current law. We indeed didn't have the political science provision. Number 2, under limitations and no flexibility. Well, our declaration said we had a gazebo for everybody's enjoyment, but it had gotten dilapidated and the previous board tore it down. So conceivably, we could confuse a buyer who read the declaration and thought there was a gazebo, or even somebody who was upset about not being able to enjoy the gazebo could challenge the board and the association saying, I'm entitled to a gazebo, you have one in the declaration. Example of a conflicting or inconsistent provision. We had 2 documents that said 2 different things about the opportunity for an owner who didn't have a car to rent out his or her carport space to another resident. Interesting examples of ambiguous and difficult to interpret. Our bylaws were not very clear about if a unit was co-owned, did both people have to sign to make the vote count? And if only one person signed, it appeared that that would only count as half of the vote. We weren't counting them that way, but it could have been counted that way. We had something that said the window coverings must be of a neutral color. That's like commercial vehicles, isn't it? If you're a Broncos fan, blue and orange are neutral colors, but we didn't really want that. We found a text in the bylaws that said any owner, I have a typo there, any owner that is on title as an entity must identify the person who can vote for that unit. Do you know what that means? I had no clue. So happily, Paul knew. He said, oh, no, an entity means if a unit's owned by a business or a trust or an LLC. Oh, okay, now I understand. So we rewrote that so anybody else could understand. We found that the sentence in the paragraph about amend the rules for how you would amend the declaration ran 22 lines long. Now that's what lawyers do so that you have to pay lawyers more to interpret the documents they wrote. Happily, Melissa Garcia and Altitude are not that way, and that's one reason I love their work. But we rewrote it as 5 sentences. And then we had undesirable issues, mainly the some aspects of the rental provisions, which probably aren't worth explaining now because they're off topic. But if you're interested in rental issues, I have a story to tell you. After we did that, then we brought in Altitude Community Law. This is very important if your compliance committee has 4 nerds who think they know what they're doing but have no legal background, because they can really mess things up by not writing the right legal language. And Altitude did a very thorough review, and here are a few examples of things they brought up that we had overlooked. One was to permit voting by electronic means. We'd been doing that. People could vote in an annual meeting by scanning their ballot and emailing it to the managing agent, but the bylaws didn't say people could vote that way. We had a borrowing limit of $10,000, and the lawyer said you might want to increase that for inflation, so we did. And we had a provision that said if the owners do a petition and call a special meeting, that they can, if 75% of the people there want to do new business, they can. And when I was squabbling with the board, I actually, because I'm a political campaign guru who likes to do this kind of stuff, I was plotting that if we needed to remove a board member, we could call a special owners meeting. And then when we got there, have 75% of the people stand up and say, we want to vote to remove the board member. Well, our bylaws said you can do that. Kiowa says you can't. So
Interesting.
we were told to remove that. Okay, well, here's one thing we did very well that Melissa brought up. Once you're done, don't just say, okay, send it out, it's a vote. You might be blindsided. We distributed the draft documents, and then we had a discussion time at a board meeting. And one owner pointed out we made an error. When we were reading the bylaws, we were surprised that board members could get compensated for services, not just reimbursed, but actually paid for something. We said that's a conflict of interest. We wanted to rewrite that. We unintentionally rewrote it to prohibit any owners from getting compensated. So when somebody caught that, we fixed it. And then, interestingly, since Melissa brought up quorum, Altitude suggested you got a 50% quorum requirement, reduce it to 25%. Well, we have a very activist community, and proposing a reduction to 25% provoked a massive outcry with many people contacting the board and telling other people to do it. So we finally compromised at 40%. And then the last part was to put it out for a vote, which was the part we did the worst. We've had some communication difficulties. It's hard anytime, but especially in a pandemic. We sent it out without sufficient explanation. The managing agent's lawyer said we're supposed to have one page for the declaration, one for the bylaws. So people didn't realize there were two separate votes. They kept one and returned the other. Out of 200 units, we actually had 30 where people didn't vote the right way. They either didn't sign their name, or they did return just one of them, or they forgot to check the for or against box. So plan on multiple communications, especially in a pandemic. Door-to-door or phone follow-up may be necessary. We were hesitant to go door-to-door, so we did a lot of phoning, and make sure to give very clear guidance. We did have first mortgagee issues as well. And in our case, happily, our declaration gave an easier process. I think our board president forgot to tell Altitude Community Law because they were giving us the complicated process until we realized we didn't have to do it. That's basically what we went through. And that may provoke some comments, questions, or if you had anything to laugh at. I didn't hear enough laughs. We'll try to